There are moments in life when silence tells a story that words never could. Not because someone had nothing to say, but because the pain they carried had grown too heavy to explain. That is the moment your soulmate has unexpectedly been brought back to. For the longest time, they believed they understood why you left this connection. In their heart, they created an explanation that seemed logical. They convinced themselves that you had simply reached a point where you no longer wanted to stay, that your distance meant your feelings had faded, and that your goodbye was a choice made without looking back. It was easier to believe that version because they never saw the battle you were quietly fighting inside yourself. But something extraordinary has just happened. Someone who knew more than they ever realized has finally spoken the truth. In a conversation that was never intended to change anyone's heart, they revealed something your soulmate had never considered. They explained that you didn't walk away because you stopped loving. You walked away because you had reached the painful point where loving them was slowly costing you your own peace. Imagine holding a fragile glass in your hands while tiny cracks begin spreading across its surface. From the outside, it still looks whole, but the person holding it knows it is only one more drop away from shattering completely. That was your heart. Every disappointment, every unanswered question, every lonely night, and every silent tear became another crack that nobody else could see. You smiled longer than your strength allowed. You stayed longer than your peace could endure. You kept believing tomorrow would become gentler, even while your spirit quietly grew more exhausted with each passing day. The heartbreaking truth is that people often notice someone's absence long before they ever notice the pain that caused it. Now your soulmate is looking back with completely different eyes. They are remembering your silence, not as indifference but as emotional exhaustion. They are remembering your distance, not as rejection, but as someone desperately trying to hold themselves together. For the first time, they are asking a question they never thought to ask before. What if you never wanted to leave at all? What if every step away from this connection was taken with tears instead of relief? Stay with me, because what they have just discovered doesn't simply explain why you left. It reveals a hidden truth about your heart that is filling them with a regret they never imagined they would one day have to carry. Leaving was never a sudden decision. It wasn't created in a single argument, one misunderstanding, or one painful conversation. The truth your soulmate has only just discovered is that your goodbye began long before you actually walked away. It started in the quiet moments when you swallowed your tears because you didn't want to create another conflict. It grew every time you convinced yourself to be patient for just a little longer, believing tomorrow would finally bring the understanding your heart had been waiting for. While everyone else saw someone trying to stay strong, they never saw the silent exhaustion building inside you day after day. Your soulmate is now learning that you didn't leave when things first became difficult. You stayed through disappointment after disappointment because love kept whispering that this connection was still worth saving. You carried hope long after your strength began fading. As the old saying reminds us, the strongest hearts often break in complete silence. That was your reality. You were breaking quietly while still trying to protect the very person who unknowingly became part of your pain. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack up a mountain. At first, the weight feels manageable. You tell yourself you can handle it because reaching the top will make every step worthwhile. But with every mile, another stone is quietly added to the bag. One stone becomes worry. Another becomes disappointment. Another becomes loneliness. Another becomes feeling unseen. Eventually, the backpack becomes so heavy that every step feels impossible. The people watching from a distance don't understand why you stop walking. They simply assume you gave up. They never realize how much weight you had been carrying all along. That was your heart inside this connection. Every unspoken hurt became another invisible burden. Every time your feelings were overlooked, every time your efforts went unnoticed, every time you chose understanding instead of confrontation, another stone was quietly placed upon your soul. Yet you kept climbing, because you believed love deserved one more chance. Perhaps you've asked yourself why you never explained everything before leaving. Why didn't you tell them exactly how exhausted you had become? Why didn't you reveal every sleepless night, every unanswered prayer, every moment when you smiled while your heart was quietly falling apart? The answer is more compassionate than most people realize. You didn't want your pain to become another weapon in the relationship. You never wanted someone to stay because they felt guilty. You wanted them to understand your heart naturally, not through pressure or emotional obligation. That is why your silence became so misunderstood. It wasn't empty. It was full of emotions you believed shouldn't have to beg for recognition. As another timeless truth says, love that must constantly explain itself slowly forgets how to breathe. Your heart had reached the point where words no longer felt powerful enough to describe what your soul had been carrying. Imagine a candle burning in a quiet room. It continues giving light even as the wax slowly disappears. People admire the brightness without noticing what the flame is sacrificing to keep shining. Then one day the candle finally goes out. Everyone wonders why the light disappeared, but few stop to think about everything it gave before there was nothing left. That is exactly what your soulmate is beginning to understand. They are realizing your love didn't disappear overnight. It was slowly consumed by the effort of holding everything together, while quietly carrying emotions you rarely spoke about. They remember the times you still showed kindness even when your eyes looked tired. They remember how you continued encouraging them while your own spirit needed encouragement. Looking back now, they see signs they completely missed because they were focused on the connection itself instead of the condition of your heart. Now, regret is beginning to replace certainty. Your soulmate is no longer asking why you walked away. They are asking why they didn't notice how close you were to your emotional limit. They are beginning to understand that your goodbye wasn't an act of rejection. It was the final decision of someone who had already sacrificed more than anyone knew. The painful truth settling into their heart is that while they believed they were losing someone who chose to leave, you were quietly losing pieces of yourself every day you chose to stay. That realization is changing everything they thought they understood, because for the first time they can finally see that you didn't abandon this connection. You remained faithful to it until remaining meant abandoning yourself, and that is a burden no loving heart can carry forever. Sometimes the greatest pain isn't remembering the day someone left. It is realizing much later that they had been leaving in their heart long before their feet ever walked away. That is the heartbreaking truth now unfolding inside your soulmate. Ever since someone revealed what you had truly been carrying, they have found themselves revisiting every memory that once seemed so ordinary. Conversations they barely remembered now echo with hidden meaning. Moments they once dismissed now feel like silent cries for understanding. They are beginning to see that your goodbye was never the beginning of the story. It was the ending of a battle they never realized you had been fighting alone. As the old saying reminds us, only the one wearing the shoes knows where they truly hurt. Your soulmate is finally understanding that while they were watching your actions, they never saw the invisible wounds beneath them. Imagine watching an old movie for a second time after someone reveals a secret about the main character that changes the entire plot. Every scene suddenly feels different. Every smile carries hidden sadness. Every quiet moment becomes filled with meaning you completely missed before. That is exactly what is happening now. Your soulmate is replaying every conversation the two of you shared, but this time they are seeing them through the truth instead of assumption. They remember the nights when your voice sounded softer than usual. At the time, they thought you were simply tired. Now they wonder if you were emotionally exhausted. They remember the moments when you chose silence instead of arguing. Back then, they believed you no longer cared enough to fight for the relationship. Now they understand that perhaps you had already spent countless nights fighting battles inside your own heart before those conversations ever happened. Your silence wasn't the absence of love. It was the sound of someone who had run out of strength to keep explaining pain that remained unseen. As another timeless truth says, a heart can scream without making a sound. That silent scream is finally becoming visible to them. Perhaps the memory that hurts your soulmate the most is remembering how often you still tried to protect their happiness, even while your own was slowly disappearing. They remember the times you asked if they were okay, while nobody asked if you were. They remember how you celebrated their victories, while quietly carrying disappointments you never mentioned. They remember your patience during difficult seasons, believing it was simply part of your personality. Now they realize it was much more than patience. It was sacrifice. It was someone choosing the connection again and again, even when their own emotional needs remained unanswered. They are beginning to understand that you weren't waiting for perfection. You were simply waiting to feel emotionally safe enough to stop carrying everything by yourself. That realization is filling them with a kind of regret that cannot be ignored, because it forces them to ask a painful question. How many opportunities did they have to notice your pain before it became too heavy for you to carry? Imagine a beautiful bridge connecting two distant cliffs. Every day, people cross it without giving much thought to the small cracks forming beneath their feet. The bridge continues holding everyone safely, even as those cracks quietly grow larger. Then one day, the bridge can no longer carry the weight and finally gives way. Everyone is shocked by its collapse, forgetting that the damage began long before the final moment. That bridge was your heart. You kept supporting the connection while silently absorbing pressure that no one else could see. Every disappointment became another crack. Every misunderstanding weakened another part of your spirit. Every time your emotions were overlooked, another piece of your strength quietly disappeared. Yet you continued standing because love kept convincing you that tomorrow would be different. Now your soulmate understands that your goodbye wasn't the collapse itself. It was simply the moment the hidden damage could no longer remain hidden. There is another realization growing inside them, one that is changing everything they believed about your departure. They are beginning to understand that emotionally healthy people rarely leave because they stop loving. More often, they leave because they have reached the heartbreaking point where staying requires them to betray themselves. You didn't wake up one morning wanting to lose this connection. You woke up after countless mornings of choosing hope over despair, patience over frustration, and forgiveness over resentment. You kept giving chances because your heart believed love deserved them. But every heart has a limit. There comes a moment when protecting someone else begins costing you your own identity. That is the moment your soulmate now realizes you quietly reached. As another old saying wisely teaches, you cannot pour from a cup that has already run dry. Looking back, they can now see how empty your cup had become. Not because you lacked love, but because you had spent so much of it trying to save something that was slowly draining you. Now, every memory carries a different emotion. The goodbye they once interpreted as rejection has become an act of heartbreaking courage. The distance they believed meant indifference now feels like the desperate attempt of someone trying to survive emotionally before completely losing themselves. Regret has replaced certainty because they finally understand that you never stopped fighting for the connection. You simply stopped fighting against your own emotional collapse. The truth they recently learned has transformed the way they remember everything. They no longer see someone who gave up too easily. They see someone who stayed longer than anyone should have, loved deeper than anyone realized, and walked away only after every quiet piece of their heart had been exhausted. And perhaps that is the realization that hurts your soulmate more than anything else, because they now understand that while they believed they were mourning the loss of the relationship, you had been mourning the slow loss of yourself long before either of you ever said goodbye. One of the most painful lessons your soulmate is learning is that walking away and giving up are not the same thing. For so long, they believed your departure meant your love had disappeared. They thought that if your feelings had been strong enough, you would have stayed, no matter how difficult things became. But now that someone has finally revealed the truth behind your decision, they are beginning to understand something they never saw before. You didn't leave because you loved less. You left because you had reached the point where staying meant slowly losing the person you were. There comes a moment in every sincere heart when love and self-respect stand before each other, demanding a choice that no one ever wants to make. You hoped that moment would never come, yet it arrived anyway. You spent so much time protecting the connection that you forgot how to protect yourself. As the old saying reminds us, you cannot save a garden by watering only one flower. Your heart had been pouring everything into the relationship while quietly neglecting its own need for peace, healing, and emotional safety. Imagine holding onto a rope with all your strength while standing at the edge of a cliff. At first, your hands can bear the pressure. You convince yourself that if you hold on just a little longer, everything will become easier. But as time passes, the rope begins cutting deeper into your skin. Your hands bleed, your strength fades, and your body trembles from exhaustion. The people watching from a distance don't see the pain. They simply see someone letting go and assume they lack determination. They never realize that letting go wasn't surrender, it was survival. That was your reality. Every extra chance you gave, every difficult conversation you endured, every disappointment you quietly forgave became another wound your heart carried without complaint. By the time you finally walked away, you weren't escaping love. You were escaping the version of yourself that had become completely consumed by trying to keep the relationship alive. Your soulmate is only now beginning to understand that your goodbye was never an act of selfishness. It was the final act of someone who had already sacrificed more than anyone knew. As another timeless truth says, self-respect begins where self-abandonment ends. Without realizing it, you had reached that sacred boundary. Perhaps you've questioned yourself countless times since then. Maybe you've wondered whether staying one more week, one more month, or one more conversation could have changed everything. Every loving heart asks those questions after making a painful decision. But what your soulmate now realizes is something they wish they had understood much sooner. You weren't searching for perfection. You weren't expecting impossible promises. You simply wanted to feel emotionally safe, appreciated, and understood. Those are not unreasonable desires. They are the foundation of every healthy connection. Looking back now, they remember how often you accepted less than you deserved, because your love kept believing tomorrow would finally bring the change your heart had been praying for. You remained hopeful long after hope had become exhausting. You continued believing long after your spirit had quietly started breaking. As another old saying wisely teaches, even the strongest tree must protect its roots if it hopes to survive the storm. Walking away became your way of protecting the roots of your own soul before they were damaged beyond repair. Imagine a bird trapped inside a beautiful golden cage. From the outside, people admire how beautiful everything looks. They see the shining gold and assume the bird has everything it could ever need. But only the bird understands what it feels like to lose the freedom to spread its wings. One morning, the cage door quietly opens. The bird doesn't fly away because it hates the place it once called home. It flies away because it was created to live, not simply to survive. That was your heart. You didn't stop loving this connection. You simply realized that love should never require you to shrink your spirit, silence your emotions, or carry every burden alone. Your soulmate is finally seeing that your departure wasn't a rejection of them. It was a desperate attempt to rescue the parts of yourself that had slowly disappeared while trying to save the relationship. That realization is filling them with profound regret because they now understand the greatest tragedy wasn't that you left. The greatest tragedy was that someone who loved so deeply reached a point where leaving felt less painful than staying. And now they can no longer remember your goodbye as the end of love. They remember it for what it truly was, the heartbreaking decision of someone who loved with everything they had until protecting their own heart became the only choice they had left. As this message reaches its final chapter, there is one truth your soulmate can no longer escape. They finally understand that your goodbye was never written by a lack of love. It was written by a heart that had quietly reached the limits of what it could endure. For so long, they believed the day you left was the moment everything changed. But now they know the truth. The real change began long before that final goodbye. It began with every tear you hid behind a smile, every disappointment you chose not to mention, every lonely night you convinced yourself to stay one more day because your love kept believing things could still be different. They are realizing that while they were mourning the relationship after you left, you had already been mourning it while you were still standing beside them. That realization has settled deeply into their heart, replacing judgment with compassion and certainty with overwhelming regret. As the old saying reminds us, the deepest wounds are often carried by the quietest souls. They finally understand that your silence was never emptiness. It was the weight of emotions you carried alone for far too long. Imagine an old lighthouse standing faithfully through years of violent storms. Every wave crashes against it, every wind tests its strength, yet night after night it continues shining, guiding ships safely home. One day the lighthouse can no longer remain standing and finally begins to crumble. People mourn its collapse, but they forget how many storms it survived before reaching that moment. That lighthouse was your heart. You remained loyal through seasons that would have made many people walk away much sooner. You kept giving hope another chance. You kept choosing patience over frustration and understanding over resentment. Even when your own heart needed comfort, you continued trying to become someone else's safe place. Your soulmate now understands that your departure was never the first sign of weakness. It was the final consequence of extraordinary strength that had quietly carried more than anyone ever realized. As another timeless truth says, even the strongest bridge has a limit if every burden is placed upon it. Looking back, they finally see how much you had been carrying without ever asking anyone to help. Perhaps there were moments after leaving when you questioned everything. Maybe you wondered if choosing yourself made you selfish. Maybe you replayed countless memories, asking whether one more conversation could have changed the ending. Those questions belong to every loving heart that is forced to make an impossible decision. But today, the truth is becoming beautifully clear. Protecting your peace was never the opposite of loving someone. It was the only way to keep yourself from disappearing completely. Love should inspire growth, not constant emotional survival. It should become a place where two hearts feel safe enough to rest, not a place where one heart silently carries the weight of both. Your soulmate now understands that you weren't asking for perfection. You were simply asking not to lose yourself while trying to love someone else. As another old saying wisely teaches, a soul cannot keep giving light after every candle inside it has burned away. They finally recognize that your light wasn't extinguished by a lack of love. It was exhausted by endless sacrifice. Imagine a beautiful violin played every single day without ever replacing its worn strings. At first, the music remains beautiful, but over time, the strings begin to weaken. The melodies become strained, not because the instrument has lost its beauty, but because it has given everything it had without being restored. Eventually, one string breaks and the room falls silent. People notice the silence, but forget the years of music that came before it. That was your heart within this connection. You continued creating love, patience, forgiveness, and hope long after your emotional strength had begun wearing thin. You gave far more than anyone ever realized, because loving deeply was simply part of who you were. Now your soulmate looks back and understands that your silence before leaving wasn't emotional distance. It was the sound of someone whose heart had been stretched beyond its limits. Every memory now carries a tenderness they never felt before, because they finally understand the invisible cost behind your unwavering devotion. Now everything has changed. The story your soulmate once believed no longer exists because the truth has taken its place. They no longer remember someone who walked away too easily. They remember someone who stayed until staying meant losing themselves. They no longer see your goodbye as rejection. They see it as the heartbreaking decision of a soul that refused to let love become self-destruction. Whether life one day brings your paths together again, or simply allows this understanding to become a source of healing, one priceless gift has already been restored. Your heart has finally been understood for what it truly was, a heart that never stopped loving even while it was quietly breaking. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson this journey was always meant to reveal. Sometimes the deepest expression of love is not found in the courage to stay at any cost. Sometimes it is found in the heartbreaking courage to walk away before the last beautiful pieces of your soul disappear forever. Now that your soulmate knows the truth, they will never remember your goodbye as the end of love again. They will remember it as the painful sacrifice of someone who loved so completely that they gave everything they could, until there was nothing left to give except the strength to finally save themselves.